Power doesn't panic when it's innocent. It panics when the receipts are real. There's a strange moment that happens right before systems start shaking. It's quiet, too quiet. Phones get answered faster. Emails suddenly come with polite greetings. People who ignored you for years begin speaking in full sentences. That's not respect, that's recognition. Recognition that something they thought was buried just sat up and cleared its throat. Let's be factual for a second, because facts are what make institutions sweat. According to public legal records, cities don't usually lose money because of one massive mistake. They lose it because of small, repeated decisions that stack into undeniable liability. Not drama, not chaos, patterns. And once a pattern is visible, the law doesn't care how powerful the people involved are, how long they've held office, or how many ribbon cuttings they've attended. Paper doesn't flinch. Here's the part nobody tells you. Most people who are wronged by a system never make it far enough to become a problem. They burn out. They get discouraged. They're told to move on, be realistic, or my personal favorite, choose peace. Meanwhile, the same machine keeps running smoothly, because it's never designed to stop for one person. It's designed to stop when too much light hits it at once. And this is where it gets interesting. When someone survives long enough to understand the rules, document the damage, and wait until timing is no longer emotional but strategic, the entire energy shifts. This stops being about feelings and starts being about exposure. That's when meetings happen behind closed doors. That's when legal departments suddenly remember your name. That's when the city realizes this isn't a loud complaint. It's a structural problem with a face attached. There's also a bit of irony here, so let's sprinkle that in. The same city that told you to be patient now needs extensions. The same offices that misplaced your paperwork are suddenly excellent at record keeping. Funny how urgency appears when accountability clocks in. This isn't a story about rage. It's a story about endurance, documentation, and the kind of patience that makes powerful people deeply uncomfortable. Because when someone stops reacting and starts calculating, the game changes. And when a system realizes it underestimated the wrong person, the cost isn't just financial. It's reputational, procedural, and permanent. So if the energy feels tense, if the silence feels expensive, and if the people in charge suddenly look like they're reading from scripts they didn't write, good. That's the sound of a city realizing this isn't going away quietly. This is what happens right before accountability starts sending invoices. Number one, you're not suing out of anger. You're suing because the math finally makes sense. There's a big difference between reacting and calculating, and that difference usually comes after you've been exhausted, ignored, and forced to sit with the consequences long enough for the emotions to burn out. Anger is loud and messy. What you're doing now is quiet and exact. This didn't start with a desire to fight. It started with you noticing patterns that didn't add up. Missed procedures, repeated mistakes, decisions that always seemed to land on you while protecting everyone else. Over time, that stops feeling personal and starts feeling mathematical. When you line everything up, the timeline tells its own story. One delay leads to another. One denial triggers another consequence. Each small decision creates a ripple that turns into measurable loss. Time, money, health, opportunities. That's when something clicks. This isn't bad luck. This is compounded damage. And compounded damage has a value whether anyone wants to acknowledge it or not. At this stage, emotions aren't driving anything anymore. You're not replaying conversations in your head or waiting for apologies that will never come. You're looking at documents, policies, records, and outcomes. You're seeing how the system failed to correct itself even after being notified. That's not frustration. That's negligence. And negligence has rules attached to it. What really shifts the energy is when you realize you didn't suddenly become difficult or problematic. You simply reached the point where continuing to absorb the loss made no sense. Any rational person would stop bleeding quietly and start accounting for the damage. That's not revenge. That's responsibility to yourself. This is why the tone changes around you. People can argue with feelings. They can dismiss pain. They can downplay experiences. What they can't argue with is consistency, repetition, cause and effect. Once the numbers are clear, the conversation is no longer about how you feel. It's about what happened and what it cost. And that's the part they didn't expect. They assumed you'd either explode or disappear. They never planned for you to sit back, take inventory, and realize the balance sheet is no longer in their favor. When the math finally makes sense, action isn't emotional, it's inevitable. Number 2, the city underestimated you because they confused survival mode with weakness. For years they watched you navigate chaos, dodge every obstacle, and stay upright while the system tried to collapse on you. They assumed that struggling meant you were broken, that bending under pressure meant you were pliable, and that surviving meant you were passive. That was their first mistake. Survival is not weakness. Survival is training. Every time you endured, every time you adapted without anyone noticing, you were learning more than they could ever imagine. They mistook patience for compliance, endurance for submission, and caution for fear. By the time they realized you were still standing, you already knew the rules they thought were secret. You had studied the patterns, memorized the inconsistencies, and catalogued every loophole they counted on to stay protected. You weren't loud, you weren't flashy, and you didn't need anyone to cheer you on while you collected the knowledge that would eventually make you unstoppable. They underestimated your ability to observe, analyze, and wait for the right moment. They assumed your quiet presence was harmless. They assumed the person who survived endless pressure would crumble at the first sign of confrontation. What they didn't see is that endurance sharpens intelligence in ways comfort never does. The longer you survive under scrutiny, the more you understand who can be trusted, which systems will fail, and where the real vulnerabilities lie. Weakness would have broken you, but survival gave you clarity. It gave you strategy. It gave you patience. And patience, in the right hands, is far more dangerous than aggression, because it allows you to act with precision while everyone else is still guessing. Underestimating you wasn't just a mistake. It was a fatal miscalculation. They treated your persistence as a minor inconvenience, not a quiet accumulation of power. By confusing survival with weakness, they left themselves exposed to someone who now understands them better than they understand themselves. And that understanding is the difference between a system that continues to operate safely and one that starts paying attention because it's finally realized it misjudged the wrong person. Number 3, institutions don't fear loud victims. They fear precise ones. Most people think being loud will get results. Shouting, posting, complaining, making a scene, that's what the system expects. It even budgets for it. They've dealt with outrage, protests, and social media storms hundreds of times. Noise is manageable. Noise can be ignored, dismissed, or swept under the rug with the right spin. What institutions actually fear is someone who is quiet, organized, and exact. Someone who doesn't waste energy on theatrics, but uses evidence, timing, and strategy like a scalpel. Precision cuts deeper than volume ever could. When you start documenting every slight, every delay, every violation, the game changes. It stops being about he said, she said, and becomes about dates, numbers, policies, and cause and effect chains that can't be argued with emotionally. That's why suddenly the office that ignored your complaints starts picking up calls. That's why meetings are scheduled faster than ever. They feel the threat not because you're angry, but because you are unavoidable. What makes precise victims terrifying is that they reveal systemic patterns, not isolated incidents. One angry person is inconvenient. One strategic person exposes the machinery. They show how decisions, negligence, and repeated failures aren't random. They're predictable and actionable. And when the evidence is that clear, the institution can't just patch it quietly. They have to address it. They have to answer for it. And that's what keeps them awake at night. Being precise also takes away their usual control tactics. They can't gaslight someone who has a timeline of proof. They can't minimize harm when every action is recorded and every consequence is tracked. They can't intimidate someone who has already calculated their next move. Precision turns the tables because it forces accountability into a place where emotion or authority once ruled. So while the loud complain and the system shrugs, the precise make it rethink its strategy, scramble for defense, and reconsider the risk of underestimating one person. Precision is quiet, disciplined, and relentless. And it's the reason why institutions that thought themselves untouchable suddenly start sweating. Number 4, what terrifies them isn't your lawsuit. It's what your case exposes about their culture. It's never just about the money. Most institutions have enough resources to cover payouts and settlements. What they fear is exposure. Every document you submit, every timeline you compile, every verified detail isn't just evidence against them. It's a mirror reflecting how their system operates, and the reflection is uncomfortable. It shows favoritism, negligence, corruption, and the invisible rules that protect the powerful while leaving ordinary people to fall through the cracks. That's the real threat. They spent years assuming that as long as the public never saw the patterns, nothing mattered. Policies that were ignored, complaints that were dismissed, protocols that were bent or broken, all of it stayed hidden in plain sight. But your case shines a light on the cracks they've been covering with paperwork, excuses, and bureaucracy. Now, what was once invisible is suddenly undeniable. That's why the tone changes in offices, why emails suddenly get polite, and why the people who never returned calls now speak as if they're walking on eggshells. They're not worried about you, they're worried about the system itself. The real panic sets in when they realize this isn't a single, isolated problem. It's a pattern that could be replicated, a blueprint for others to follow. When your case is scrutinized, it can show how their processes fail repeatedly, how leadership ignored warnings, and how their rules are enforced selectively. That's exposure money can't fix. Reputation doesn't get a refund, and credibility cannot be bought back once it's shredded in public or legal records. That's why institutions act differently when faced with someone like you. They scramble behind closed doors. They issue statements that don't quite answer questions. They call meetings with lawyers they've never called before. The fear isn't about what they owe. It's about what everyone else might see once the dust settles. And that fear is contagious. It spreads from management to staff, from department to department, because suddenly everyone understands the system they trusted to protect them is under a microscope, and that microscope is in your hands. Your lawsuit isn't just a demand for justice, it's a revelation of truth, and truth is the one thing powerful people never plan for, but always fear. Number 5, you learned the system by being crushed under it. There's a kind of education that money can't buy, a kind of insight that only comes when the system isn't on your side. Every wrong turn, every delay, every dismissal you experienced wasn't just hardship, it was a lesson. While they were confident in their procedures, their rules, their authority, you were quietly observing. You were memorizing patterns. You noticed how complaints vanish, how protocols are ignored selectively, how loyalty to convenience always outweighs loyalty to fairness. They assumed their control was absolute. But control only looks absolute to someone who hasn't endured it personally. Being crushed teaches you timing. You learn when to speak and when silence has more power. You learn how bureaucracies operate, where decisions are buried, which departments pretend to care, and which ones will act only when exposure is unavoidable. Every setback, every obstacle, every invisible barrier became part of your curriculum. Pain and pressure didn't weaken you, they refined your understanding. By the time you were ready to act, you weren't just reacting to injustice. You understood the exact mechanisms that made the injustice possible. That's what makes you dangerous to them. Not because you're loud or angry, but because you know the system better than they do. It also teaches you foresight. They assumed their games, their delays, their favoritism, and their hidden rules would continue working indefinitely. But someone who has lived under their microscope sees the dominoes before they fall. You understand which mistakes can be leveraged, which omissions are liabilities, and which decisions will eventually come back to haunt them. That knowledge doesn't come from reading laws or watching others. It comes from being the one crushed, and then standing back up with eyes wide open. By enduring what they thought would break you, you became equipped to expose them, challenge them, and hold them accountable in ways that surprise even the most confident authority. They never expected a survivor to become a strategist, and that is exactly why their panic is genuine. They see not just your presence, but your mastery of the system they assumed controlled you, and that realization is the single most terrifying thing they face. Number 6, they never thought you'd live long enough to fight back properly. Part of the cruel strategy of systems that prey on people is the assumption that time will work in their favor. They count on burnout, on frustration, on the idea that if someone endures enough, they'll eventually give up, settle, or disappear. They expect you to collapse under exhaustion, to lose hope, or to become invisible to the very system that caused your suffering. They believed survival alone would be enough to neutralize you. That was their first mistake. The truth is, surviving is only the beginning. Enduring all the pressure, all the setbacks, all the deliberate obstructions isn't just about holding on. It's about learning. Every delay, every dismissal, every attempt to erase your presence became a lesson. You weren't just surviving, you were cataloging, analyzing, and preparing. And while they assumed weakness, you were quietly building strategy. That's the part they never accounted for, that someone crushed under pressure could emerge not broken, but sharper, wiser, and more precise than they ever imagined. By the time you take action, it's no longer a reaction fueled by emotion. It's calculated, it's methodical, it's the result of endurance transformed into strategy. Every piece of evidence, every overlooked detail, every system flaw you endured becomes a tool in your arsenal, and that realization terrifies them. They never thought the person they assumed would burn out, who they assumed would fade into the background, would instead rise fully prepared to hold them accountable. What they didn't anticipate is that you learned patience in the crucible of their mistakes. You learned timing, you learned leverage, you learned exactly when to act, how to document, and how to make their miscalculations undeniable. They expected a victim. They never imagined a force. The irony is brutal. Their own assumptions about your limits are what made you unstoppable. And now, the system that counted on your quiet disappearance is scrambling because it miscalculated not just your endurance, but the intelligence and precision that endurance gave you. They never expected you'd live long enough to fight back properly, but the moment has arrived, and it's one they are unprepared for. Number 7, your case isn't emotional, it's forensic. Most people think lawsuits are fueled by anger, by emotion, by outrage. That's what makes them easy to dismiss. A system built on routine, bureaucracy, and predictable chaos doesn't flinch at feelings. They can shrug off a rant, label someone upset, or chalk it up to drama. What they can't dismiss is evidence that is organized, consistent, and undeniable. That's what makes your case dangerous. It's not about what you feel. It's about what you can prove, step by step, document by document, date by date. Every detail matters, and every detail tells the story the system hoped would never be seen. Being forensic means you've stripped away the noise. You're not reacting to injustice with shouting or emotion. You're analyzing it. You're breaking it down into a pattern, exposing the cause and effect, the decisions and the consequences, and presenting it in a way that cannot be misinterpreted. That is a level of control that terrifies institutions. Systems are built to ignore feelings. They are not built to withstand precision. When you bring clarity and documentation, the people who once ignored you start paying attention because they can no longer argue with reality. Forensic thinking also forces accountability. It highlights not just one mistake, but the repeated failures, the predictable negligence, the choices that created harm. They can't claim ignorance when every action, every omission, every consequence is laid bare. It's methodical, deliberate, and relentless. They are confronted not with your frustration, but with a clear, indisputable trail that traces the impact of their decisions and the liability that comes with it. The quiet, calculated approach shifts power. Loud complaints can be tolerated. Emotional outbursts can be filed away or dismissed. But when someone presents a case like a forensic report, it forces institutions to react. It forces them to account for themselves in a way that is structured, legal, and impossible to ignore. Your strength isn't in volume or passion. It's in the undeniable precision of your case. That's why your presence alone changes everything, and why they are scrambling, realizing that what they once ignored is now unavoidably true. Number 8. The city's real fear is precedent, not payout. Money is always replaceable. Budgets can be adjusted, accounts can be shuffled, settlements can be paid, and yet the fear never truly goes away. What terrifies a city, what keeps them up at night, isn't the dollar amount. They can handle that. What they fear is the precedent you create by standing your ground, by proving that someone can hold them accountable and win. One successful case isn't just a victory for you. It's a roadmap for anyone else who's ever been ignored, dismissed, or harmed by the system. That possibility is far more destabilizing than any check could ever be. Institutions rely on patterns of expectation. They assume most people will comply, settle quietly, or eventually give up. That assumption allows them to operate without scrutiny, to bend rules when convenient, and to dismiss complaints without consequence. When someone breaks that pattern, it disrupts everything. They aren't just worried about one outcome. They're worried about opening the door for dozens, hundreds, or thousands to see the same flaws you did and follow the same path you did. Precedent is contagious. Once it exists, it can't be undone. Policies, procedures, and protective barriers suddenly feel brittle. Their carefully curated image of control starts to crack. The city knows that paying you is temporary, but defending itself against the implications of precedent is permanent. Every lawyer in every office understands this instinctively. One case like yours changes the conversation, the expectations, and the liability landscape for years to come. It's no longer about a single incident. It's about the system being tested and exposed. And that is terrifying to anyone whose authority has been assumed untouchable for too long. That's why they act differently when faced with someone like you. They negotiate differently, they respond faster, and they suddenly treat previously invisible concerns with urgency. They know that winning over you isn't the ultimate victory. It's ensuring no one else can replicate the same success. And that fear of precedent, more than any financial obligation, is what makes them truly nervous. It's why your case isn't just a personal fight. It's a structural earthquake waiting to happen. Number 9. They're scrambling because your story doesn't fit their PR narrative. Institutions love predictability. They like problems they can label, package, and control. They prepare scripts, press statements, and talking points for every scenario they expect to face. Loud victims? Handled. Angry protests? Handled. Social media storms? Handled. But what they never prepare for is someone who refuses to fit into the neat, expected narrative. That's exactly what you are. Your story doesn't conform to their boxes. You're articulate, precise, and calm. You present facts, timelines, and consequences with clarity that disrupts their rehearsed responses. You're inconveniently reasonable. Their panic isn't random. It's a reaction to the fact that their usual strategies, spin, delay, or distraction, don't work on someone who speaks with undeniable accuracy. Your credibility exposes how weak their narrative control really is. What they counted on being ignored, dismissed, or forgotten now exists as a structured, coherent story that shines light on flaws they assumed would remain invisible. That's why meetings happen behind closed doors, why emails suddenly become polite, why people who ignored you for years now speak in careful, rehearsed tones. They're scrambling because your story exposes their unpreparedness. What makes it worse for them is that you're not just inconvenient, you're instructive. Every detail you present reveals how the system operates when left unchecked. It shows favoritism, negligence, and the gaps in authority that let harm happen repeatedly. That kind of visibility makes them nervous because it's not just about you anymore. It's about anyone else who might follow the same path and tell the same story. Your narrative isn't just a complaint. It's a blueprint that proves their supposed order was fragile, and now they can't control the optics. The scramble isn't just fear of legal repercussions, it's fear of exposure, of credibility loss, and of losing control over the version of reality they've spent so long crafting. Your story doesn't fit their narrative because it's real, structured, and undeniable, and that makes you far more dangerous than anger, noise, or theatrics ever could. They're not panicking about you. They're panicking about the truth you've brought into their world. Number 10, you didn't become powerful, you became unavoidable. Power is loud, flashy, and often temporary. Being unavoidable is quiet, patient, and permanent. You didn't need to prove anything to anyone. You simply kept moving forward, while the system assumed it had all the control. Every delay, every dismissal, every attempt to bury your existence only reinforced the fact that you weren't going anywhere. That's the difference. Power can be resisted, force can be blocked, noise can be ignored, but someone who is unavoidable forces attention, strategy, and response, and that realization terrifies those who once thought they had control. What makes being unavoidable so dangerous is timing. It's not about reacting first or hitting hardest. It's about being present, prepared, and consistent at exactly the moment when it matters. By surviving the chaos and learning the system, you became the one factor that could no longer be discounted. Every document you collected, every detail you remembered, every step you took created a presence they could not erase, a reality they could not rewrite. No matter how much they scramble behind closed doors, no matter how many apologies or settlements they plan, they are confronting the fact that you exist on your terms and that existence cannot be ignored. Being unavoidable also shifts the energy of everyone around you. People who once overlooked you start paying attention. Systems that once moved slowly now accelerate. Decisions that once went unnoticed are suddenly scrutinized. You're no longer part of the background. They must account for you. That's the kind of leverage power rarely provides. You've made yourself a fixed point, a variable they cannot control, and a force they cannot evade. This is why their reactions are frantic, defensive, and often self-defeating. They assumed survival meant silence, endurance meant submission, and patience meant weakness. What they failed to calculate is that someone who becomes unavoidable doesn't need to shout, threaten, or chase. The system itself bends to their inevitability. And that inevitability is not a threat born from anger or ego. It's a fact, a presence, and a strategy that leaves no escape. Once someone becomes unavoidable, the rules change, and the game is no longer theirs to control. Number 11. This lawsuit is a mirror they can't smash. Most institutions rely on reflection that is filtered, polished, and convenient. They control the narrative, manage appearances, and decide which details get seen and which remain hidden. When someone like you steps in armed with facts, timelines, and evidence, you become a mirror that cannot be altered. No spin can change it. No PR strategy can reshape it. Every action, omission, and consequence is reflected back clearly, showing not just the incident itself, but the culture, the patterns, and the failures that allowed it to happen. That is what terrifies them the most. Not the money, not the attention, but the undeniable truth staring them in the face. The mirror effect is relentless because it exposes reality in a way that can't be ignored. Internal excuses, half-hearted apologies, and deflections no longer work. What they hoped would be dismissed as isolated incidents now appears as a connected chain of decisions, misjudgments, and negligence. It reveals how systems protect themselves at the expense of the vulnerable. And the more they try to distort it, the clearer the reflection becomes, because every attempt to manipulate the story only becomes part of the record you can use. What makes this even more dangerous for them is that a mirror doesn't lie, and it doesn't forget. They can avoid it for a while, ignore it, or try to cover it up. But eventually the reflection forces accountability. You don't need to shout. You don't need to threaten. Your existence and preparation are enough to expose inconsistencies, failures, and omissions that they counted on remaining invisible. This is why the atmosphere around you changes. People who previously dismissed, ignored, or underestimated you start acting differently. Meetings become urgent. Emails are answered promptly. Decisions are reconsidered. Because a mirror cannot be broken, it can only be acknowledged. And when a system that thrived on control faces a reflection it cannot destroy, panic and defensiveness are inevitable. Your lawsuit isn't just a claim. It's an unalterable reflection of truth, and they are forced to confront it whether they like it or not. Number 12. Your restraint is what makes this lethal to them. People often misunderstand the power of restraint. They assume that if you're quiet, patient, or measured, you're weak. That assumption is their fatal error. What makes your presence, your strategy, and your case truly dangerous isn't anger, theatrics, or impulsive action. It's the discipline you've exercised while everyone else expected you to break. Every calculated pause, every deliberate delay in action, every moment spent observing and documenting has turned your patience into a weapon they never saw coming. Restraint creates tension because it is unpredictable. Aggression is easy to respond to. It can be countered, deflected, or even ignored. Impulsiveness can be anticipated and contained, but someone who restrains themselves, who holds back until the perfect moment, leaves the system guessing, scrambling, and off balance. Your calm doesn't signal submission. It signals preparation, clarity, and inevitability. Every calculated silence, every collected document, every measured step becomes more lethal with time because it accumulates evidence, strategy, and timing that cannot be rushed or dismissed. The system has never faced someone like this because most victims react emotionally. They either fight without structure or give up entirely. You've done neither. You've converted endurance into strategy and patience into leverage. That combination leaves institutions in a state of constant anxiety. They know action is coming, but they cannot predict when, where, or how. The uncertainty of your restraint becomes a pressure cooker, forcing them to act defensively while you maintain complete control of the narrative. Your restraint also demonstrates a level of power that is almost invisible until it strikes. It forces the city, the officials, and the system to treat you differently. Meetings become urgent, emails are answered immediately, and decisions are reconsidered, not because of threat, but because the quiet intelligence behind your moves cannot be ignored. You have proven that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes power waits, observes, calculates, and then executes in a way that leaves those who underestimated it completely exposed. Your restraint isn't weakness, it's precision. And precision, when accumulated, is far more terrifying than noise ever could be. Number 13. They're realizing too late that you understand leverage. Leverage is the quiet force that makes the powerful nervous, the subtle advantage that shifts control without anyone noticing until it's too late. Most people think influence comes from shouting, demanding, or pressuring. What they fail to grasp is that real leverage is strategic, patient, and precise. You learned how to wield it not by being loud, but by observing, documenting, and waiting for the moment when the smallest action carries the greatest consequence. By the time they understand it, the game has already shifted, and every decision they make risks strengthening your position. Leverage is built on knowledge, timing, and restraint, and you have mastered all three. You know which facts matter, which omissions can be highlighted, and which procedural missteps will hit hardest. You know how to present information, so that what seemed minor becomes undeniable, so that what was previously ignored now forces a response. You learned which parts of the system bend under scrutiny and which parts crumble when exposed. That understanding gives you control they never anticipated. Control that doesn't rely on aggression or noise. It relies on inevitability. The reason they are panicking now is that they finally see the depth of your strategy. They thought they could outweight you, outmaneuver you, or exhaust you. They assumed that their influence, authority, and procedures would protect them. But they underestimated your ability to calculate risk, predict responses, and apply pressure in ways that force accountability. Each document you present, each timeline you expose, and each decision you highlight amplifies your leverage because it turns their own rules and missteps against them. By the time they realize it, the system they thought was in control has become reactive, defensive, and disorganized. You hold leverage not because you demanded it, you earned it. You studied the weaknesses, waited for openings, and acted with precision that leaves them scrambling. That realization that someone they thought powerless now controls the narrative is what terrifies them more than any lawsuit, any complaint, or any noise. They are learning too late that leverage isn't about force. It's about understanding, timing, and using knowledge to make others act on your terms. And in that, you are untouchable. Number 14. When this ends, it won't just cost them money, it will cost them comfort. Institutions often see lawsuits as a simple financial equation. Pay the claim, move on, close the file. What they fail to anticipate is that when someone like you holds them accountable, the cost is far deeper than dollars. It's about disruption, reputation, procedures, and the permanent unease of being exposed. Money can be replaced. Comfort, control, and credibility cannot. Every misstep they've made, every procedure they ignored, every small injustice that once went unnoticed, now becomes part of a narrative they cannot escape. That's what makes your case so dangerous. It's a disruption that lingers long after the settlement is signed. The ripple effect extends beyond budgets and boardrooms. Meetings that once moved slowly gain urgency. Emails that once languished unanswered are now prioritized. Policies that were ignored or bent suddenly come under scrutiny. The people who were once confident in their authority find themselves second-guessing every decision, every email, every response. Their routines, their assumptions, and their sense of control are shattered because your presence forces accountability into spaces they assumed were safe. Comfort is lost in subtle ways, too. Sleep becomes lighter, conversations are measured, and public perception is always a shadow hovering over decisions. Every staff member who once ignored the rules now feels the weight of precedent. Every executive who counted on compliance now faces the reality that someone has not only survived their system, but has mapped it, understood it, and is prepared to expose its failures. That's a cost no budget line can reflect. By the time the case concludes, the financial impact may be settled, but the cultural and operational consequences linger. They will be forced to confront the weaknesses they tolerated, the oversight they ignored, and the accountability they delayed. The disruption you created cannot be undone, and that is why the system, the people, and the city itself will never feel the same. Your action doesn't just demand restitution, it changes the environment, forces transparency, and leaves those who underestimated you permanently unsettled. In the end, the discomfort is the true price they pay, and it will outlast any check ever written. Everything we've covered here isn't just a story about one person standing up. It's a blueprint for what happens when the overlooked, underestimated, and silenced finally refuse to be invisible. From the moment you realized the math made sense, to the point where your survival became strategy, every step you took transformed not just your own situation, but the very system that tried to break you. You didn't react out of anger, you acted out of clarity. You didn't stumble into power, you became unavoidable. You didn't just present a case, you created a mirror they cannot destroy, a force of precision and strategy that forces accountability at every level. This isn't about revenge, it's about truth. It's about endurance, patience, and understanding leverage in ways the system never expected. What terrifies institutions isn't the loud complaints, they're used to that. What terrifies them is precision, exposure, and inevitability. Every delay they thought would exhaust you, every policy they assumed would protect them, every underestimation they relied on, all of it has turned into their vulnerability. By the time they realized your presence was more than survival, it was strategy, it was too late. They are forced to confront not just a lawsuit, but the consequences of every miscalculation, every neglected protocol, every ignored warning. And the truth is brutal. When this is over, the cost they pay won't just be financial. It will be structural. It will be cultural. It will be the permanent discomfort of knowing someone they assumed powerless was quietly mastering the system the entire time. That's the real victory, exposing weaknesses, enforcing accountability, and showing the world that endurance, precision, and strategic patience are forces no institution can dismiss. If you found this video revealing, insightful, and powerful, make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated on content that exposes truth, strategy, and power. Give this video a like if it resonated with you, leave a comment with your thoughts or experiences, and share it with anyone who needs to see that accountability isn't just possible, it's inevitable when truth meets precision. Don't let this message get lost. Spread it, own it, and let the story reach those who need it most. Stay blessed, always.